They erased 19 years in a single afternoon. I never thought I'd watch my own career vanish right in front of me. My badge dead, my name deleted, my seat filled by someone who didn't even know how our routes worked. They didn't fire me. They wiped me out like I was an inconvenience they couldn't wait to forget. But what they never realized was that I didn't leave empty. I left with the one thing they never understood. If you've ever been discarded or quietly replaced, subscribe and share your story in the comments. I want to hear what they took from you. I always thought if the end ever came, it would at least arrive with some warning. An email, a rumor, a shift in the air I could name. But the truth is, even when you sense something breaking beneath your feet, you never expect the final crack to sound so loud, so casual, so painfully ordinary. I walked into the building that day the same way I had for 19 years, scanning the floor instinctively, noting which crews were running behind, which supervisors were talking too fast, which vendors hadn't responded overnight. My mind still worked the way it always had, holding 1,000 tiny moving pieces in rhythm. That rhythm was my value, even if no one ever said it out loud. Maybe that's why the abrupt stop felt like a kick to the ribs. At 2:15 p.m., Evan Drayton, the 30-something efficiency specialist who'd spent more time polishing dashboards than learning how freight actually moves, tapped my shoulder with the stiff confidence of someone who believed software could replace intuition. "Trent wants to see you. Now." No explanation, no context, just that clipped tone people use when they've been rehearsing it. The walk to the glass room felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that tells you the decision is already made and your presence is just a formality. CEO Trent Calloway sat at the table like he'd been waiting to play out a scene he'd memorized. Next to him was HR Director Monroe Hale, hands folded neatly, expression carved into something between pity and boredom. They didn't say hello. They didn't even pretend this was a conversation. Trent launched into his speech, a thin corporate monologue dripping with lines about restructuring, modernization, shifting operational priorities, words that mean nothing except "you're gone and we want it to sound professional." I'd written versions of that speech for other managers over the years, but hearing it aimed at me had a sting I couldn't swallow. Evan stood in the corner, arms crossed, pretending not to listen while clearly savoring it. At one point, Trent said, "The role has outgrown its previous scope," as if the problem wasn't the 19 years of unseen labor I'd given, but my inability to morph into whatever trendy buzzword Evan had printed on his slides. They slid a severance packet across the table. I didn't touch it. I didn't ask questions. What struck me wasn't the dismissal. It was the speed. Like I was a light switch they were flipping off so the new kid could shine. When I left the room, Monroe followed me with the stiff politeness of someone escorting a guest out of a wedding they weren't invited to. My badge blinked red at the exit turnstile. 19 years and the system rejected me in less than a second. Outside, the Arizona heat slapped my face, but it didn't compare to the burn of realizing they had coordinated this down to the minute. My email locked, my login erased, my internal profile redirected to a generic role discontinued page. Not even a message to the team. They didn't fire me, they deleted me. The part that cut deepest was knowing how many times I'd saved them quietly, invisibly, without expecting anything back. I had rerouted shipments during monsoon storms, patched vendor collapses before legal ever knew, caught compliance gaps that could have cost them millions. I carried the system in my head because no one else could. And yet here I was, dismissed without hesitation, replaced by someone who thought algorithms understood Thursday slowdown patterns or why certain crews moved faster before holiday weekends. They thought they were upgrading. They had no idea what they were losing, and as I walked to my car, pulse shaking, something unexpected settled into my chest. Not rage, not grief, but clarity. If they believed I was replaceable, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The thing about humiliation is that it never arrives the way you imagine. It doesn't storm in with raised voices or dramatic declarations. It comes quietly, wrapped in polite phrases and professional smiles, wearing the mask of procedure. When I pushed open the glassroom door, the one they usually reserved for investor tours and quarterly briefings, I already knew this wasn't a discussion. This was an execution dressed up as corporate courtesy. Trent Calloway didn't even stand when I walked in. He tapped his pen against a stack of printed dashboards. Evan's dashboards, the same ones he had been worshiping for months, and said, "Let's streamline this." As if my removal was a scheduling inconvenience. Monroe Hale sat beside him with the posture of someone preparing for a long day of saying nothing meaningful. He opened a leather folder in front of him but didn't look at me, not even for a second. Evan stood near the wall, half leaning, half posing, like someone who'd trained himself to appear indispensable. He flicked through his tablet as if I no longer existed the moment I crossed the threshold. I took the last chair available, not because I wanted to sit, but because I wanted them to see me take my time. I wanted them to feel the weight of 19 years settling in the room with me. Trent began with, "We appreciate your years of dedication," which would have sounded respectful if his eyes weren't drifting toward Evan every few seconds, silently reassuring himself that the future he'd bet on was still standing behind him. But what hit me hardest wasn't the words. It was the rehearsed rhythm of them, the way he paced the sentences like someone reading a script he didn't believe. It made me wonder how many times he'd practiced this speech in front of a mirror, smoothing the edges until it sounded merciful. It wasn't mercy, it was a burial. "Your position has become redundant," he said next, the line they always use when they want to fire a person without admitting that the person was the position. That role didn't function without me, and they all knew it. Evan's supposed automation upgrade they kept touting was nothing more than a patchwork of flashy screens, digital forms, and formulas that had no concept of how real people behaved under stress. But that didn't matter now. Trent kept talking. Resource realignment, strategic modernization, operational vertical correction, a flood of corporate jargon that meant absolutely nothing except "we're done with you." I remember thinking that if I peeled back every sentence he said, I'd find a different truth underneath. We want someone cheaper. We want someone younger. We want someone who makes us feel modern. Monroe finally cleared his throat, the closest thing he'd done to participating. "Your access credentials have been updated," he said. Updated, the gentlest word they could use to describe the digital erasure of my identity. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't need to. I had been in operations long enough to know they'd revoked everything the moment Trent scheduled this meeting. My files, my inbox, my name in the system, all gone. Wiped before I even sat down. Evan didn't look at me once, but I saw the corner of his mouth lift the moment Monroe said it. I'd seen that expression before. Young, ambitious men who believe systems bent around them simply because they knew how to drag and drop a function on a dashboard. He thought he'd won something today. He thought this room was proof that he'd climbed a rung on the ladder. He didn't realize ladders collapse when they're missing the person who held them steady. Trent slid a white folder across the table. "This outlines your severance." The folder stopped inches from my hand, but I didn't reach for it. I let it sit there, untouched, a symbol of everything they thought I would rush to accept. A final token to make the removal look civilized. I folded my hands in my lap and looked each of them in the eye. I wanted to see their expressions. Trent's mild discomfort, Monroe's imposed neutrality, Evan's smug anticipation. I wanted to imprint the moment, not out of bitterness, but because clarity is born in moments like these. They waited for me to thank them. That was the part that nearly made me laugh. Instead, I stood slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for Trent to shift uncomfortably. Even the hum of the AC felt louder than their breathing. When I finally spoke, I used only 4 words. "I understand your decision. Not approval, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. Nothing more." I walked to the door, and halfway through pulling it open, I turned back. Not to plead, not to argue, but to commit something to memory. The 3 of them sitting there, so certain they'd executed a clean transition, so confident in their little performance. They didn't know they'd just cut the wrong wire. And they would feel the fallout long before they understood where it came from. When I stepped out of that building, the sun hit me like a fist, but the heat wasn't what took the air out of my lungs. It was the realization that 19 years of loyalty, instinct, and unspoken labor had been wiped out with a single meeting and a blinking red light on a badge reader. There's a particular kind of silence that comes after humiliation, the kind that wraps around you and makes the world feel like it's happening behind a pane of glass. I could hear cars, voices, doors shutting, but none of it felt connected to me. I walked across the parking lot like someone moving underwater, holding myself together because falling apart out there, in full view of the place that just erased me, felt like a second loss I wasn't willing to hand them. I didn't cry. Not then. I just kept walking, listening to my own footsteps, trying to make sense of the fact that I had predicted all of this, and yet somehow wasn't prepared for the brutality of how it unfolded. I knew the signs long before they pushed me into that glass room. No one tells you outright. You notice it in the pauses, in the way people stop asking for your input, in how you're suddenly removed from meetings you built from scratch. You catch a glimpse of a slide that used to contain your work with your name quietly erased. Someone refers to your system as legacy. Someone else stops making eye contact. The shift doesn't come like a storm. It comes like a slow leak, until one day you look down and realize you're already sinking. What I didn't expect was how deliberately they'd orchestrated my disappearance. By the time I reached my car, my phone had already logged me out of everything: email, internal apps, vendor channels, compliance threads. They hadn't even waited for me to drive away. The company I held together through staffing shortages, supply chain freezes, and holiday surges couldn't spare 10 minutes of dignity. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked like myself, but I didn't feel like her. It's a strange sensation, realizing that the place you gave so much of your life to can sever you with the precision of a guillotine. And for what? To put a shiny new analyst in my chair? To chase the fantasy that efficiency software could replace lived experience? Sitting there, I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not heartbreak, but a cold, steady understanding. They thought this was the end of my usefulness, the final chapter of someone they dismissed as outdated. What they didn't understand was that I didn't need their recognition to know my worth. The system they relied on wasn't built on dashboards or formulas. It was built on the rhythm of human behavior I'd memorized without ever writing it down. And they had just thrown away the only person who could read that rhythm. I pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a next step. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They hadn't taken everything from me. They'd taken the surface, the part they could see, the part they could replace. What they couldn't touch, what they never even realized existed, was still mine. And in time, that would matter more than they ever imagined. The first 3 days after they erased me felt like moving through fog. I kept replaying moments I didn't even realize I'd held on to. The way certain supervisors would glance toward my desk during crisis weeks, the late-night calls I took without complaint, the times I'd stepped in to reroute shipments or resolve vendor delays before anyone else knew a problem existed. Those memories didn't comfort me. They stung. Every reminder felt like proof that I had given too much trust to a place that treated me like a replaceable part. I woke up on the 4th morning to a silence I wasn't used to. No early vendor pings, no 5:30 a.m. scheduling alerts, no teams asking, "Can you take a look at this?" For 19 years, my days had been shaped by other people's needs. Now, nothing. The absence felt heavier than the work ever did. I sat at the kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee I couldn't seem to drink when my phone buzzed. A LinkedIn notification. I almost didn't check it. I wasn't ready to face messages from coworkers pretending to be shocked or managers offering empty lines like, "Wishing you the best." But the name stopped me. Sienna Rowe. I remembered her vaguely from an industry roundtable years ago. The kind of person who listened carefully, the kind whose gaze didn't slide past you in search of someone more important. Her message was short. "You once talked about systems that adapt to human patterns instead of fighting them. Are you still thinking about that?" I stared at the words for a long time. I didn't know how she remembered that conversation. I barely remembered it myself. What I did remember was how dismissed I felt after sharing the idea with my old leadership, only to be told it wasn't scalable, not measurable, not worth investing in. I closed the message without replying. I told myself I needed space. I told myself I wasn't ready. But the truth was simpler. I didn't trust myself anymore. When a place cuts you out that completely, it rearranges the way you see your own value. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. Again, a voicemail from Sienna, 5 seconds long. "I don't need your past, Renly. I need your mind." That was it. No sales pitch, no promises, just an invitation, something loosened in my chest. She didn't mention titles or credentials or years served. She didn't care about the pieces my old company had thrown away. She cared about the part no one else ever bothered to see. I replayed the voicemail twice before finally calling her back. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. We met the next morning at a small workspace she rented downtown. No polished floors, no glass walls, no rows of silent employees pretending to be grateful. Just a whiteboard, 2 desks, and her. She asked me what I saw wrong with the systems I used to work in. Normally, I would have measured my words, softened my critique, but something about her steadiness made honesty feel safe again. I told her what I saw. She listened, really listened, and for the first time since that classroom meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Possibility. Sienna didn't waste time with formalities or long onboarding speeches. After our first meeting, she simply handed me a stack of printouts, messy vendor logs, inconsistency reports, missed handoffs, strange timing gaps, and said, "Tell me what's underneath all this." Not what was written, not what the numbers pretended to say, what was underneath. I hadn't realized how much I missed being asked that question. In my old job, the unspoken rule was simple. Don't look deeper than the dashboard. Stick to the metrics. Trust the software. Ignore the gut feeling that told you when people were slipping, when pressure was rising, when small failures were about to snowball into catastrophes. But in Sienna's workspace, that instinct was the point. I spent hours circling patterns with a pen, scribbling notes in the margins, pointing out inconsistencies that would never show up in digital reports. This vendor slows every July. No one logs why, but it happens. These crews always reroute the same week every quarter. It's not in the schedule, but it's predictable. Every year during the 3rd week of March, this team misses deadlines. Something's happening behind the scenes. None of it was magical. It wasn't even complicated. It was human rhythm, habits, stress cycles, weather patterns, staffing quirks, the things that never fit cleanly into boxes but always shaped the outcome. Sienna watched me work with a kind of fascination, like she was watching someone restore an old language. "You're mapping behavior," she said. "Most people don't even see behavior." That was the moment PulseNet began forming in my mind. Not a dashboard, not a compliance engine, not an algorithm pretending it understood people, but a framework built around the idea that human patterns aren't noise. They're data, real data, the kind companies ignore until it costs them everything. We sketched the first version across 3 whiteboards. I talked while she translated my words into charts and connections. Workers slow down after consecutive night shifts, even if the schedule calls it balanced. Mark that as a red zone trigger. Suppliers in certain regions respond differently after extreme weather warnings. Pulse that into the timeline as a delay expectancy. Crew performance stabilizes when the same lead runs Monday and Tuesday, but drops when a rotation interrupts their flow. Build that in. PulseNet wasn't about correction, it was about anticipation. It learned the rhythm of the workforce without pretending to be anything other than what it was. A human pattern tracker. Within 6 weeks, we had a prototype, and within 3 months, 2 mid-sized logistics firms agreed to pilot it. They didn't need convincing. They were drowning in the same operational blindness I'd lived through. They saw immediate results, drop-offs that no one noticed, subtle shifts in worker communication, vendor habits that predicted delays before they surfaced. For the first time, decisions were made before the fire started, not after the smoke alarm screamed. The feedback came quietly. Emails between managers, whispers at conferences, questions asked in private. How did your team see that problem coming? What system are you using? Can it handle workforce fluctuation? PulseNet wasn't flashy, but it was undeniable. It worked because it wasn't built on illusions. It was built on the truths I had carried alone for 19 years. Truths that my old company dismissed as outdated instincts. Sienna saw it differently. "You weren't obsolete," she said one evening as we locked up. "You were unrecognized." For the first time in a long time, I believed she might be right. PulseNet had been live in 2 companies for barely a quarter when the first ripple from my old world reached me. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when Arizona heat sits heavy over everything, when even the air feels exhausted. I was reviewing a cluster of timing irregularities from one of our pilot clients when Sienna stepped into the room with her phone in her hand and a strange look on her face. "We just got a demo request," she said, "a big one." I didn't think much of it until she read the email. "Urgent inquiry, vendor stabilization and workforce rhythm analysis for Q3 implementation, requesting earliest demonstration." The address was corporate, sterile, nothing unusual, but the signature stopped my breathing for half a second. Mason Lark, Procurement Director. My old company, my old department, my old chain of chaos. I hadn't spoken to Mason in almost a year. He wasn't cruel, but he was the kind of man who lived and died by deadlines. If he was reaching out now, it meant something was falling apart. Hard. I kept my expression steady, but inside, a quiet pulse started beating. Recognition mixed, with something sharper. Not revenge, not triumph, just clarity. I knew exactly what kind of trouble they were in. PulseNet had been designed for these moments. Moments when operations start slipping in ways metrics can't explain, when vendors go silent because they're overwhelmed, when the workforce rhythm fractures under pressure, but no one knows how to read the signs. I stayed silent while Sienna drafted a polite response. She didn't know the history. She didn't know the weight that name carried for me, but she sensed enough to glance at me and ask, "You okay with this?" I nodded because the truth was simple. They weren't coming to me. They were coming to the solution built from everything they threw away. The demo was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. Sitting in that room would have felt like stepping into a past I had already buried. Instead, I worked quietly in our back office, reviewing PulseNet logs while Sienna presented to a group of executives who had no idea the framework stitching their broken operations back together came from the woman they cut loose without hesitation. After the session, Sienna came back to the office with a half-stunned smile. "That was intense," she said. "They're in trouble." Something about 37 suppliers going dark at the same time? Their teams can't figure out why communication's collapsing. I almost laughed, not out of cruelty, but recognition. I knew that pattern. I'd seen it forming even before they let me go. When you ignore the small human signs, the timing gaps, the tone shifts, the seasonal fatigue, systems fail in clusters, not individually. That's what PulseNet was built to catch. "Did they ask who created it?" I asked. "No," she said. "They just want it, badly." Of course they did. They were chasing the very thing they tried to replace, the invisible rhythm I once carried silently through every crisis. Now they needed it more than ever, and they had no idea they were already orbiting the one person who understood exactly why their world was unraveling. They moved faster than I expected. Within a week of the demo, they pushed through a contract, routed it through emergency funding, and scheduled PulseNet for rapid deployment across 2 of their most vulnerable departments. Sienna handled every meeting. I stayed out of sight, working on refinements, calibrations, and interpretation models from behind the scenes. I didn't want them to see me. They didn't deserve to. The morning the system went live for them, Sienna forwarded me a short internal announcement. Corporate language polished to a shine, full of phrases meant to sound visionary. But 2 lines made me stop breathing. "We are transforming our operational resilience by adopting a pattern-responsive stabilization platform." And then, the one that cut deeper. "This tool is built on the understanding that human rhythm is the first indicator of structural failure." I knew those words. I had written them in a memo during a December crisis, 2 years before I was fired, a memo no one acknowledged. One Trent dismissed as too theoretical. And now he was using those same words, my words, as the centerpiece of their rollout speech. Sienna didn't know the history, but the moment she saw my face, she understood something personal had been touched. "Do you want me to say something?" she asked. I shook my head. Why would I want to interrupt them? They were already living inside the truth they'd ignored. Over the next few days, PulseNet began sending them prompts, subtle warnings about vendor fatigue patterns, drop-offs in crew timing, silent signals in shift communications. They followed the alerts like gospel. Everything they once brushed off as Renly's instincts was now coming to them dressed in clean reports and tidy indicators. They trusted it completely because they believed it belonged to someone else. And that was the moment I realized the real climax wasn't vengeance. It was invisibility. They were rebuilding their stability on top of a structure shaped entirely by my mind, my memory, my years of work. They talked about innovation. They praised modernization. They credited leadership for the strategic pivot. But every improvement, every saved contract, every corrected problem traced back to a rhythm only I knew how to read. They didn't see me, and they didn't need to. My imprint was everywhere. Not loud, not celebrated, but unmistakable. And they were paying for access to the one thing they never valued when it stood right in front of them. The first Monday after their rollout, I woke before dawn out of habit. For nearly 2 decades, that was the hour I'd brace myself for the week's first wave of breakdowns. Missed resets, delayed reports, vendors dragging from weekend chaos. I used to carry all of that alone, silently anticipating what everyone else overlooked. Now, as the clock struck 6:05 a.m., PulseNet did what I used to do. It surfaced the early fractures before anyone else noticed. My phone lit up with the system's reflection logs. Nothing I needed to act on, just quiet confirmations that the patterns I once carried in my head were now etched into something stable and untouchable. Not theirs, mine. I sat by the window with my coffee, watching the sunrise slide across the desert, and for the first time, I felt no pull toward the place that discarded me. I didn't wonder what meetings they were having, what fires they were dealing with, what explanations they were scrambling to invent. Those things used to define my worth. Now they didn't touch me at all. In the days that followed, word spread quietly through industry circles. PulseNet was exceptional, uncannily accurate, eerily predictive. People asked Sienna about our methodology. They tried to trace where the insights came from. They couldn't, because the knowledge wasn't extracted from files or manuals or systems. It was born from years of watching, listening, absorbing, years of understanding people and patterns deeper than the metrics ever could. That was the part they never understood. They thought firing me meant ending my contribution. They didn't realize they were clearing a path for it to grow beyond their reach. I didn't need a title or a department or a badge to validate what I had always known. I needed room to build something without being dismissed, and I found it. Or maybe it found me. When PulseNet stabilized its first major contract for them, I received the forwarded report. Risk averted due to early rhythm anomaly detection. They celebrated the win, not knowing the source. I didn't smile out of spite. I smiled because I had finally learned the truth. Power doesn't always come from being seen. Sometimes it comes from stepping back so far that no one realizes the ground they're standing on was laid by your hands. I closed the report, finished my coffee, and stepped into the quiet of my own life. One I built, one they could never erase, one that didn't need their recognition to exist. I didn't realize how much the experience would cost me until the noise finally stopped. When you spend 19 years holding a system together, you don't notice the slow drain. You don't notice how your shoulders stay tense even on weekends, or how you answer messages during dinner without thinking, or how you haven't taken a real breath in years. I thought I was strong because I could carry everything. I thought loyalty was supposed to hurt a little. What I didn't see was how much of myself I had traded away for the sake of keeping other people comfortable. When they let me go, it felt like losing a limb. But in the quiet that followed, I understood something I had ignored for too long. I had built my entire life around a company that would erase me without hesitation. That realization cut deeper than the firing. It made me face the truth of how much trust I had handed over blindly, believing that hard work and responsibility would protect me. They didn't. And that's the personal cost no one prepares you for. You think you're just doing your job, but slowly, piece by piece, you give away your time, your sleep, your peace, your energy, until one day you look up and realize you don't recognize your own life without the pressure you've been carrying. I'm not angry the work was hard. I'm angry I convinced myself that the burden made me valuable. I see it differently now. Strength isn't in holding everything together for people who don't notice. Strength is stepping back before you break. If I could tell a friend anything, it would be this. Don't let a job cost you more than you can afford. Protect your energy. Pay attention to what drains you. And remember that your worth is not tied to how much weight you can carry. How to get started. Today, notice one thing you've been carrying alone and ask yourself why. Set one boundary, even a small one, and keep it. Schedule a break you normally talk yourself out of. Tell someone you trust how tired you really are. Write down the signs you've been ignoring. What part of my experience felt closest to something you've lived through?